here at Pragma Lawyers, and I specialise in employment law matters and occupational health and safety. So I'll be touching on today industrial manslaughter. What is it? What can I do to protect my business? And what are the risks and liabilities there? And then I'll be talking briefly about another part of the new occupational health and safety legislation, which is the introduction of a specific reference to psychological harm into the legislation, and how your business can take some steps to manage the risk of psychological harm. And then I'll be handing over to Nola Pierce from TraumaSim, and she'll be talking about some really practical, hands-on ways that your business can manage those risks further. So perhaps we should get started, and let's talk first about industrial manslaughter. Now, this is a really hot topic. It's been in the press, there's been a lot of discussion about it. In my practice, I've received a lot of inquiries, a lot of concern calls from my clients saying, what is it? What can I do? And what do I need to understand as a part of my business? So you're probably all aware that employers and really people who are conducting a business or undertaking, that's the new language, so contractors, suppliers, etc. They have duties in relation to health and safety. Now, what has happened in the last 6 months is we've got a new piece of legislation that's come in. So we've got the new Work Health and Safety Act that was passed into law earlier this year. And as part of that act, we've got a new offence, so a crime under the law of industrial manslaughter. So what's industrial manslaughter? I hear you asking very loudly. So industrial manslaughter, it applies where a person, so that can be a company or a director or officer of that company, has a duty in relation to health and safety. They failed in that duty, and then as a result of that failure, there's been a death of another person. And so I want to touch on there firstly, before we get into the penalties and a real life example of how this type of legislation applies. I want to touch on the first point. So this is a crime, and you can be charged with this crime if you're either a company, so the business, the entity, the corporation, but also if you're a director or officer of that company. So you're probably aware that employers and companies who are undertaking a business, they have a duty to take reasonable steps to manage risk for their workers and for people coming onto their work site, their workplace, their premises, etc. But directors and officers also have a duty to take reasonable steps to ensure that the company is complying with that duty. So not only is this a crime that can be levelled against your company, but also against senior members of your company. So your directors, your really senior managers, and anyone who has that individual personal duty, who should have known better and who should have done more, but didn't. And the other key thing, I guess, we need to be aware of with industrial manslaughter is the penalties. What's the stick that is being introduced with this legislation? Now, the penalties are really steep. You can see them on the slides. So if it's a company that's being charged with industrial manslaughter, the maximum fine that can be levelled against them is $10 million. If it's an individual, so a director or another senior member of the organisation, the fine is $5 million maximum. But relevantly, for everyone who's listening today, it's also possible for imprisonment to be ordered of up to 20 years for an industrial manslaughter offence. So this is really serious, and obviously the consequences, both for the company in terms of that really big dollar value fine and the individuals, are really significant. And I want to talk about how this has been applied in practice. Now, this industrial manslaughter offence has just been introduced in Western Australia, but it is in the same terms as other offences from around Australia. And the whole goal of putting this new Work Health and Safety Act together in WA was to make sure that we have consistency across all of the states. And that's what we're really seeking to achieve. So I want to talk briefly about a recent Queensland case where a company and its directors were actually prosecuted for industrial manslaughter, and the offence was similar to what we have in WA. Just to give you a real life example as to how the courts are looking at defeats and the consequences for that business and for the individuals. So the case that I want to briefly touch on, it's about Brisbane Auto Recycling. I won't bore you with the citation, but it's from the 11th of June 2020. So around a year ago now, so pretty fresh. So in this case, we had Brisbane Auto Recycling, which is a recycling company. They had staff on site at their warehouse type premises. A particular employee was driving a forklift. They hadn't taken reasonable steps to designate forklift driving zones. They hadn't taken reasonable steps to make sure that people weren't walking through those zones. And very unfortunately and tragically, another employee got run over by a forklift that was driven by their colleague, and they passed away as a result. Now, there was a history with this particular company of non-compliance. They've been warned before by their equivalent of WorkSafe. And they were actually prosecuted for industrial manslaughter. Now, the company was prosecuted, but also the two directors who ran the day-to-day operations of the business. They were also brought into court and charged with industrial manslaughter. And they were found guilty, of course. And these were the penalties, particularly for the directors, which I think is the most relevant for everyone listening today. So the directors were found guilty of industrial manslaughter, and they were ordered to pay a $3 million fine. So that's an individual paying a $3 million fine each. And they were both ordered, had imprisonment orders, so 10 months suspended. So suspended meaning that they didn't actually have to go to jail, but if they had any offence in the next 12/24 months, they'd be in jail for 10 months. So not only is there a risk here in terms of the financial side of things, potentially livelihood, if you are convicted and you've got that type of imprisonment hanging over your head, but there's also a bigger thing at play that I briefly want to touch on before we talk about psychological harm with industrial manslaughter. There's the obvious reputational general damage to the business. These types of prosecutions are relatively uncommon, they're relatively rare, because businesses on a whole are doing their best to comply with their obligations. But the effect of being prosecuted for industrial manslaughter obviously has an ongoing negative effect on your business's reputation with its suppliers, its customers. We've seen all of that happen in the past with the prosecutions that we've had. So if you want to have a couple of things to take away about industrial manslaughter, I would tell you this, that you should be aware that both the company and your individual senior managers and directors can be liable for this offence, that it all boils down to you and the company having taken reasonable steps to manage the risk that led to the death. And if you're doing that, if you've got your policies, you've got your procedures, and you're actually following them in practice, you're taking care, you're identifying risks, you're dealing with near misses, then you're putting yourself in the best position possible if you do find yourself in a really unfortunate situation where you have a death on your site or your premises. So there's a couple of other changes, and then we'll talk a bit about psychological harm before I pass over to Nola. So just a couple of other relevant changes that come into play here. So like I've mentioned, officers of a company have an explicit duty to take reasonable steps to make sure that the company is doing what they can to manage occupational health and safety risks. So there's a personal duty on your directors, your senior managers, etc. And coupled with this, coupled with your industrial manslaughter and the specific duties on directors and senior officers, WorkSafe now has a couple of new bows in arrows in their quiver, I should say. So they've got some enforcement powers that have been expanded. So what this should all tell you is that the laws are getting stricter. We've got a new offence, which is a crime, industrial manslaughter, and WorkSafe are sharpening their teeth. So now more than ever, businesses need to be aware about what their obligations are and what they can do to manage those risks. And if I turn now to just touch on the second thing we wanted to talk about today, it's the recognition of psychological health or psychological injury under occupational health and safety. So what we're talking about here is with this new work health and safety bill, they've actually specifically included that psychological health is a part of health, and and safety, that's what you as a person undertaking a business has to take reasonable care in relation to. So there's a specific reference to psychological health, which is significant. So, and the way I think that we need to, the reason why I wanted to talk about this today is that it's not always, psychological health is obviously quite a complicated area, and it's hard to know if you haven't had any specific advice or assistance, what can you do? But there's a really specific category of psychological illness and psychological risk that you can really take easy steps to manage. And I've put up a statistic on the slide here, which I found in researching this presentation, and I think it's going to be quite surprising to you, but also quite informative of our discussion today. So this is from a WorkSafe published report, and it's from 2014-2015, which was the last period they gathered this data. But I think from anecdotal evidence, it still rings true today. In that period, amongst the work-related stress claims that were filed in terms of workers' compensation, 7% of those claims related to an employee or another person witnessing a traumatic event. So an accident, an injury that was particularly graphic, traumatic, etc. And that's something I don't think we usually think about when we talk about psychological health. We usually think about work-related stress, micromanagement, bullying, sexual harassment, but we don't think about the effect of a traumatic event on a person. And so I wanted to highlight that today before I pass over to Nola from TraumaSim, who's got some really practical ways that you can manage that risk. But from a general perspective, in terms of, okay, what do? I know that there's a risk to health and safety about psychological harm. What do I do? Well, it's really important that you identify the particular risks in your business. So are you, for example, in the road transport industry, where there might be a potential for one of your contractors or employees to witness a traumatic car accident? Is that something that I need to be planning for? Are you in aged care or health services, where there's that trauma fatigue that can sometimes build up in first responders or carers as well? So really have a look at your workplace and identify what are the mental health risks here. If you do have an accident or a traumatic injury, traumatic event, and your contractors or employees are there, offer support. Don't wait for them to come to you. Most people won't, in our experience. So offer that support and make sure you follow that up, not just on paper. Really provide tailored support to them. And then just in general, be proactive. What can you do to not only address the risk, not only be compliant, but to be best practice? What programs can you assist your workers with to make sure that their mental health is managed appropriately and doesn't create that type of unacceptable risk to themselves and to everyone else in the workplace? And with those points to sort of set up our discussion, I'd like to hand over to Nola from TraumaSim, and she's going to talk through some really practical ways to manage those types of risks.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much, Madeline, for that great introduction to industrial manslaughter and the psychological harm, because it is such an important subject, and I think a lot of businesses are struggling to get their head around it, and I think it's definitely worth putting a lot of thought into. Just a little bit of background about myself and why I'm speaking around this subject. I have a business called TraumaSim, and TraumaSim is all around simulating realistic injuries for emergency and medical training. So we're sort of in the business of trying to reduce risk by better preparing people for incidents that might occur. My personal background is that I was an intensive care nurse for many years. So I've personally seen a lot of real trauma, and I'm very aware of how that can impact on people, which was the motivation for developing TraumaSim. In regard to the subject today, in recent years, we've seen a lot of first aid training move more to an online type of training. We feel that that's really sanitised the first aid training, and it's disconnected it from reality. It's thought that this is cost and time efficient, but it's probably not as effective for the outcomes that you were seeking. There's many examples of first responders that who can't perform once they're actually in a real life situation, even after significant investment in their training. So if that training isn't quality training, then they may not be able to deal with what they have to cope with. And that's obviously a risk for the injured person, but it's also a risk for that first aider himself and a risk to the business. So it's definitely worth a lot of thought. Treating trauma casualties is a very stressful and unpleasant business, but it is real life, and it is what we need to better prepare people for, so that they don't damage themselves or others. A practical hands-on element to any sort of training around first aid is very important to both the outcome and the students' confidence to perform the skills they need to perform. So we are seeing now more and more first aid training companies that are offering realistic training to try to fill that gap and to better prepare those people. There are quite a lot of studies that show that realism in training significantly improves the outcomes via mental preparedness, response, resilience, recovery, and potentially reduction in post-traumatic stress disorder. Being able to give students exposure to realistic wounds and injuries means that they aren't dealing with this for the first time when they see it in the real world. And hopefully they can move past that initial shock and treat the casualty with some confidence. This exposure also improves their resilience and their capabilities. The Australian Defence Force have been using that type of training for many, many, many years. And we're seeing it more and more introduced into civilian training now to use those same benefits and to focus on saving lives. All of this in high-risk workplaces, people are moving towards simulation training to test their personnel, their safety systems and their compliance. First aid trainers in Western Australia will probably expect to see a bit of a rise in requests for realistic training and scenario-based training following the introduction of these new laws. There's also, I guess, changes that are coming in because ASQA, that lay down all the accreditation for training, they recently made changes to the national accreditation where they implemented that advanced first aid courses and beyond must now use practical training aids to teach hemorrhage control. Those training aids are all around being able to apply tourniquets and wound packing on a realistic training aid that actively bleeds and responds when you treat it. That type of level of training doesn't have to be implemented only at advanced and above. It can be introduced at the provide first aid level where it's considered that there is a risk for the industry it's being taught to. So if you look at your industry and you have looked at the traumatic injury that might involve massive hemorrhage is a significant risk for your injury, for your industry, for your workplace, then you might consider having a look at that level of first aid training that you have and just asking the question, is that sort of hemorrhage control training included in that course? First aid trainers now are needing to undertake extra learning and to develop their curriculum to include the wound packing and tourniquet application. This is similar to the Stop the Bleed program that was initiated in the US after the Boston Marathon bombings. And it's become quite an important part of first aid training, as hemorrhage control is vital to saving lives. We've always considered that CPR and keeping someone's heart circulating their blood around is the most important thing, but we also know that people can fully bleed out in about 2 minutes. So if we don't institute control of that type of massive hemorrhage, then we'll be lost. This has been a big change for a lot of the first aid training companies. Their first aid trainers need to be confident that they're teaching these skills correctly, as some of them may not have had experience with that in the past. So first aid training itself is undergoing quite a lot of changes, but there are other ways that businesses can reduce their risk by testing their emergency systems and their personnel in their workplace. Often in the past, this has been done with desktop exercises, but we would really recommend that businesses consider running live simulated emergency exercises periodically to fully test their system. These types of simulation training has highlighted gaps in the systems and it's shown opportunities for improvement that aren't picked up in the traditional desktop style of testing. Being in the moment highlights system failures and raises questions that may not have been identified previously. And we've seen that a lot in some of the scenario training that we've been involved in. The image that I think we have on the screen there is a recent scenario that took place in a workplace used to test emergency response teams. And that included communications, all of their safety procedures, everybody's role in what happens if something happens, right down to the first aid and the first aid responders' ability to do their job. The medical realism, we feel, is crucial in the team's understanding of the wounds and their injuries and how they're treated and how they best manage the casualty. Repetition of that type of training does improve their first aiders' confidence in knowing that they know what to do and their ability to do it. Feedback is provided after that type of training, and we look at recommendations for improvements and to close the gaps on any risks and any poor performance. We've seen very experienced on paper medics that have fainted during some scenarios because while they've done a lot of study and they feel in their head that they can answer questions, they might have done exams very well, but can they actually do it in the heat of the moment under that stress of casualty that's bleeding or screaming and you know, all of that sort of chaos around them. Some people just find that that reality is where they fall apart. And so we really feel that a business's a part of their obligation is to test those people are actually able to do the job when they need to. So I would ask, have businesses truly identified all the risks within their environments? What are their risks? Are they forklift accidents? Are they gas bottle explosions? Any sort of massive hemorrhage from workplace accidents, burns? What are their risks and have they tested their people to deal with those specific events? Have they provided all the responsible staff with the necessary training to respond effectively? A few examples of where we've been involved in this type of training. The Queensland Police Force, a couple of years back, they brought in hemorrhage control training for all of their officers that were working in the field because they are often the first responders ahead of when the ambulance service will get there. My apologies. And we made bespoke products for their particular needs and they've used those widely. Queensland Rail, they do scenario training every year and they look at a different risk and they put their personnel through all of that type of training to make sure that they can fully respond. So the big question is, you need to ask yourself, are your emergency personnel, including your first aid officers, equipped with the skills and resilience to cope in an emergency? And trainers must ensure that they're delivering correct training, and businesses should ensure that their first aid officers and response teams do realistic training in some form. and consider testing their systems with a live simulation. So I'm going to get Madeline back up here with us, and we'll answer some questions.
Yeah, Harriet, do we have any questions?
No questions yet. We have some pre-prepared here. So does TraumaSim provide simulation training?
So TraumaSim aren't an RTO themselves. We partner with other RTOs to provide that sort of support for realistic training. We can run scenarios in workplaces where we work with the first aid people on site and the emergency response people to plan a scenario appropriate to their workplace, and we can assist with getting all of that ready and providing that.
Amazing. And how much does training like this cost?
It varies a lot depending on the scope and the size of the business, the size of the project, the number of personnel that will be included, but we can pretty much work within any budget and any workplace to find something that fits for them.
And I think it's important note there as well in terms of an employer or a business's obligations in relation to health and safety. It's what's reasonable in the circumstances. So there's no one size fits all. So it's really important that when you're looking specifically at the risks around first aid training and trauma scenarios, that you get some specialist advice about that works and is tailored to your employees, your industry and your business. And your approach as well. Are you looking for a compliance focus, or are you looking for a best practice full service type service as well?
And how often should businesses do this type of training?
Well, there's no actual requirement for live training under the system at the moment. We would recommend that annual is a good idea, and also if you've had a big turnover of staff. So if you have personnel that haven't done that type of training before, we'd consider that you might want to do it a little bit more often, and a balance between desktop exercises and live scenario exercises would probably be wise.
Amazing. So the basic first aid course doesn't cover OSH requirements going forward?
Well, it is an accredited course, but you need to ask yourself, does it fit the needs of your particular industry and your workplace? It may do, but it may not. It may have some gaps that you might need to look at, just depending on what your risks for your business are.
And what do you mean by realistic simulation training?
What we mean is that training can be made to be very realistic. Wounds can be applied to mannequins or to other participants in the class, so role players can have injuries applied to them. Some of those can be very quick to do, but can provide a lot of realism for the people that are undergoing that training. So there's those types of injuries. There's also training aids that they can practice their skill on. Some of those training aids will actually bleed. They'll look completely as if they're real, and that just better prepares people for how they're going to deal with that.
Definitely. And I've got one more question here. So I'm a WA trainer doing an advanced first aid training. Will I be liable if a worker has an accident after I've provided training?
You'd only be liable if you've done something wrong. It would be my understanding, and I might lean on Madeline here, but if you've trained appropriately and everything's been done well, I don't think there's any risk there. But a trainer needs to be up to date, and they need to be aware of the changes that came in under ASPR last year, and make sure that they have those new skills that they need.
Absolutely. So if one of my clients came to me and said, look, this has happened, what do I do? You know, is there a risk to me here? The first thing I'd be asking that client is, okay, well, what have you done? What's the training that you've done? What are the scenarios that you've run through? What are those reasonable steps that you've taken? And it may be the case in the specific scenario that there were more things you could do. You could have had the realistic simulation training. that might have been something that really helped to support or prevent the foreseeable risks in a legal sense. So there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question, but the more of those sort of 1%ers, we call them, that you can do to show that you've taken those reasonable steps, the better position you're going to be in if you do have to face a scenario where you need to get advice about your liability. Great. All right. Well, I think that's probably all the time that we have today. So thank you very much, Nola, for coming in. That was fascinating. And a really, I think, key area of occupational health and safety that isn't touched on and that's certainly going to come into play with industrial manslaughter coming in. So thank you all for attending today. If you do have any questions following the webinar today, feel free to get in contact with Nola or myself. Likewise, if you need a copy of the slides, get in contact, we'll make them available to you. Thank you all.
Thanks very much.